Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Modus Cafe. Today with Amanda Fitt. She's our in-house nutritionist, and she'll be talking about fueling misconceptions that climbers have. And I'm very, very excited about it. I hope this will clear up a lot of confusion out in the field. And Amanda's been working for us since the beginning of the year, and she is our nutritionist for our members in our membership, Stronger Together. And what she does there is she runs regular workshops for our members, and they're really awesome, and they're recorded, and they're there in the cloud for a lifetime. And I actually met Amanda online. I started following her. I'm a nutrition coach myself, and she just is very, very thoughtful. She provides a lot of science-backed education, but she also has a nutrition coaching background. That means she really knows how to talk to people as well. So one of the things I love about her, and I really like how data-driven she is and very curious, and she likes to try things out. That's my introduction for Amanda, but I want to ask you, Amanda, can you please give your own introduction for us today before we get started?
Yes, of course. Well, so happy to be here. This is very fun. I love podcasting. So I'm Amanda. I am a clinical nutritionist, a certified nutrition specialist, and I mainly work in my private practice with outdoor athletes. So I love working with climbers, love working with cyclists, runners, oftentimes a myriad of all of those things, strength trainers, strength trainees, I guess you could say. And yeah, so I love the topic of fueling, and we'll kind of get into that in a little bit, but I am just so passionate about helping athletes use food as a means to not only perform better in their sport, but also just feel better in their day-to-day lives. And I just think food is so powerful, it's so healing, it is so empowering. So it is just something that I am so fortunate that I get to tell people how to do better overall.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I love your passion too. And I think that's one reason you're such a good fit for a membership too, is because we do have a lot of athletes who perform more than one sport. But even just we have a great variety of athletes who perform even within the sport of climbing different disciplines. And one of the things we'll cover at the end today is how to fuel differently, whether or not, you're at the gym sessioning and training really hard, whether or not you're outside climbing, let's say for half a day, cragging or bouldering, or whether or not you're actually trad climbing and really are like running around in the mountains all day long. And the fueling strategies for that change a little bit. And I know you just did an in-depth workshop on this in our membership. So the podcast will not be as in-depth, but anybody who might join our membership down the road or who's part of our membership does have access to the recording as well. And Amanda is a climber herself, which I want to emphasize is very important. So she knows what she's talking about. And yeah, should we get started, Amanda? I see in our notes that you have 4 different fueling misconceptions that you wanted to cover today.
Yes, definitely. So, and when like a little intro to this, we're really going to be covering like mid activity or mid climbing session fueling. So we're not really going to be talking about like the meals before or after per se, really kind of narrowing down on like what to do during your sessions. And the reason why I'm so excited about this topic, especially for climbers, because oftentimes, and this is kind of a little intro to point number 1 here in terms of misconceptions climbers have, is that climbers often don't think that they actually need to fuel during their climbing sessions. And if we were to look to other sports like cycling, like running, there's a huge body of evidence out there on fueling nutrition strategies during activity, during training, during performance. And we don't have quite that much in climbing yet, but we can absolutely extrapolate a lot of that information and be able to apply it to ourselves and how, what type of activity we're doing overall. And it makes such a huge difference. It's like this really easy thing to implement that can totally up-level people's climbing. So I just want to give that little introduction on like why this is important overall.
Great.
Cool.
Yeah. Do you want to get started with point number 1?
Yeah. Let's do it. So the very first fueling misconception, like I said, is that you actually don't need to eat or don't need to fuel during your climbing sessions. And this isn't actually always the case. So one thing that I just want to kind of teach super fast or educate on is the word glycogen. So I'm sure you know what glycogen is, Katya, but for people who are listening, glycogen is really the storage form of sugar that we store in our muscle cells and that we store in our liver. And sugar, especially glucose, is what we need to actually produce energy in our body to power all of our movements, especially muscle contraction, like we're doing during climbing overall. So the reason why we have to actually eat during our climbing sessions, and I'm going to specify lengths of time here in a minute to get really, really clear about when this is appropriate and when it might not be quite as important overall, is because we only have so much stored sugar in our body that we can utilize. And once it's gone, it's gone. And our body then has to work really, really hard to create the substrates that we need to actually be able to produce the energy. And that sends us into situations where you're like bonking, or you just like crash, or you can't do the thing anymore. You like can't do the move because you're just out of juice, basically, is the way that I like to describe it. And so to negate that, we actually have to eat during our sessions.
Yeah, actually, thank you for that. I think it's such an important one. And I think a question that I often get is this idea of, well, it's not a cardio heavy sport, right? And you might talk about this idea that, yeah, okay, of course, if you're running and biking, of course, you need more fuel, but climbing is so not super intense for cardio. But one thing I'd like to point out, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, is that I mean, our bodies and especially our brain, they just need sugars. And I know sugar seems like this bad word, but when you think about the biochemistry, sugar is the fuel for our brain because fats and proteins cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. So we actually need sugar for our brain. So the problem is if our blood sugar runs low, we also can't think as clearly. And I like to remind people that climbing is cognitively a highly loaded sport. Like we need to be able to think really well to solve problems and even like to deal with to manage our fears, like simple things. We need our brain to be really functioning and not just our physical body. So it's really important that we do actually have enough sugar in our blood. And the sugar in our blood, if we don't eat regularly, comes from the glycogen that Amanda just talked about. So I think, yeah, that is a really great point. Do you want to speak to the length of the sessions? Like at what point you'd suggest people should eat or not worry about it?
Great question. Yeah, absolutely. So the rule of thumb that I like to give, if your sessions are lasting longer than 75 to 90 minutes, then realistically, you should be fueling with something mid-session. So to say that in a different way, if your sessions are less than 90 minutes or less than 75 minutes, there's again always some variables that we can kind of play around with here. You technically don't have to fuel, although sometimes I recommend it anyways, depending on like how much you've eaten during the day already, or maybe
Yeah.
your energy levels, right? So many different factors involved. But technically speaking, the amount of stored glycogen that you have in your body, depending on the intensity of your activity, can last you roughly 75 to 90 minutes. So that's where that number comes from, essentially, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
what if someone literally just ate just before the session? Either they had a breakfast or they had lunch or maybe even a snack. How does that change whether or not they need to eat in a session?
Great question. So it would really depend on the session length. So let's say if someone had lunch and an hour and a half later, they were going in for a climbing session. If that climbing session was only 60 minutes long, I don't need that person to eat anything at all. If that person was going in for a 3-hour gym session, I would absolutely want them to have something to eat. So not so much what they have before, rather how long is the actual session itself.
I see. Even if I eat my breakfast and I drive straight to the gym and 20 minutes later I do my 2-hour workout, you would still recommend eating during the session.
So again, kind of, always some nuance here. So
Yeah.
yes, normally I would, just because I'm always pro fueling, like
Yeah.
what's kind of the harm if not having to take 5 seconds in between a boulder problem to eat a quick piece of dried mango or something of the sort. So if I had to give that answer to a client, I would say eat anyways. But again, everyone can kind of use their best discretion there. But again, I'm always pro food in those cases.
Yeah. Can I
Yeah.
just ask you another follow-up question? This is such an
Yeah.
interesting and important topic because, that the elephant in the room is that people, mostly climbers, are worried about gaining weight because it's such a strength to weight ratio sport. And
Agreed.
that's a whole nother topic we can actually maybe talk about at some point. Obviously, you and I believe very much in fueling, but could you just explain briefly why fueling during a session will not necessarily lead to weight gain? I love talking about this to my athletes as well. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for bringing this up because I think this is a huge barrier for so many athletes in terms of, especially if there is like, body composition goals or something at play. People are like, well, I don't want to eat because I don't want to gain
Mhm.
weight. So again, and this is why I love that you are a biochemistry gals because we can really talk about this, going back to actually how our body uses glucose when we are moving is very different than how our body uses glucose at rest. So I don't know if people understand kind of the role of insulin and how, we eat something, especially a carb, our blood sugar goes up. Basically, we release insulin to help shuttle it out of our bloodstream, take it into the cells, bring it back down to baseline. When we're moving, we can actually do that whole process without insulin. So we are able to then suck that sugar that we just ate. Again, I say sugar, carb, whatever that looks like, from your bloodstream into the cells and immediately use that not to store fat, but actually to produce ATP, that energy. So it's
Mhm.
just a totally different mechanism.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
is really wonderful. And so essentially, maybe I'll say this in other words, what Amanda is
Yes.
saying based on the biochemistry, as long as you are exercising and you're fueling while you're exercising, the process by which your body absorbs the sugar is different. So it's not going to just convert it to fat because your body's going to use that sugar right away.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I'm sure there's an upper limit. We're not encouraging people to like stuff themselves with croissants, like, oh, you're climbing, go and bring 5 croissants. That's not what we're saying. Amanda's going to give a suggestion for how much to fuel in a minute too. So there is this balance, but we're not saying, stuff your faces, but we're saying, make sure you fuel appropriately and regularly while you're exercising. And you don't have to worry about weight gain when you do that. I always like to tell my clients while you're exercising, that is the best time to have these more carbohydrate richer things versus eating them at night while you're watching something. So if there's some treats that you enjoy, well, that's the time to eat them. Fuel yourself and enjoy them.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
I
love that.
love point number 1 already. I can't wait to hear the other 3, but this might
Okay.
already be the banger of the podcast.
Yeah, I know, right? Okay, point number 2. And now this is a specific example because again, I talk to a ton of
Yeah,
climbers. I
that's
always tell
great.
them
Yeah.
what they fuel with normally, right? And so this is something that I hear really specifically. And this is really referencing, it could be a gym session, but also like days out, whether you're bouldering, cragging, whatever it is. Hard-boiled eggs, trail mix, and carrots are an appropriate climbing day snack. That's a misconception. Okay. Let me just break this myth right now. So you might be thinking those are all incredibly healthy foods. Absolutely. And in fact, I would love for you to bring all of those foods with you out cragging. But what we're missing here are carbs, basically. So hard-boiled eggs are going to be a protein. Trail mix, nuts are going to be a combination of protein and fat. Carrots do have a little bit of carb in there, but it's mostly fiber, mostly a veggie, especially if you're eating it raw. So really what we're lacking here is that carbohydrate to provide that fuel, that sugar that we need just in conversation that we had 2 seconds ago to really produce the actual energy overall. So yes, those foods are great to include, but I would also add in carbohydrate rich snacks in addition to those things to serve this whole purpose that we're talking about.
Yeah, I love this so much. When I read this point number 2 at first, I was like, wait, I like all these things. But I was like, oh, I think what she's gonna talk about is probably that there's just something missing here. Because as you said, they're all very healthy. And it could be if people, I think the trail mix particularly is something that I hear a lot of people fueling on. And then maybe still not feeling very energetic or like they have a lot of energy. And so this is likely because of what Amanda said is you're not fueling appropriately in terms of balancing your macros or balancing your food. So no one is saying don't eat hard-boiled eggs, hummus, or carrots. Bring them all, but make sure you balance them out with enough carbohydrates. And Amanda will tell us in a second sort of how to do that. Great. Love
Perfect.
that point. And now I want to eat hard-boiled
Amazing.
eggs though. I love
I
them.
know. Or egg salad. Yay.
Yes.
Okay, are we ready for number 3?
Yes.
Okay. Just packing a lunch for a day out cragging is enough. I've climbed with a lot of people where they don't eat anything all day. We're out there hours, and they're like, okay, it's lunchtime. They pull out their lunch. Maybe it's like a PB&J, maybe a couple things, and that's that. That's just not enough food overall. So, and especially we're going to, again, go into the different scenarios here a little bit later, how fueling might look different for a gym session versus an outdoor day, etc. But what I really want to drive home is that, especially on an outdoor day, we're out there for multiple hours. So in addition to those carbohydrates that we need on a regular basis to give us the fuel overall to produce energy, we also need calories, just generally. So just one tiny meal, one bolus of food is just not going to be enough. So I really encourage people to bring multiple things. So I'll jump ahead a little bit, but one little rule of thumb is think about how many hours that you're going to be out. If it's 6 hours, that's about how many snacks that you need to bring, about 6. So that's one way to start thinking about this and breaking it up in a way that you're still going to be getting enough calories over the course of your outdoor climbing day.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, one of the things to keep in mind too is, everybody can obviously make their own decisions, but today we're talking about fueling for performance. So if you wanted to perform as, best as possible, that's probably going to help you. So if you're someone who feels like, oh, I can do 1 or 2 pitches, but then I just don't have the juice anymore, it might be a fueling strategy. That's often also the simplest way. And, as a coach, as a climbing coach, it's really surprising. But sometimes when we talk to our athletes about improving their climbing or training sessions, sometimes literally the cheapest and simplest way for us to help people improve their training sessions is have a snack. Literally, seriously, happens. It improves, and everybody has the same reactions. Like, oh my gosh, I was able to not only like enjoy a better workout, but feel better. Like leave the gym not feeling drained, leave the gym actually feeling joyful too. Like as I said, our brain needs that sugar too. And just like it helps with our mood, especially when we're training and doing hard things. So I'm just saying, trust Amanda, give it a try, what she's about to suggest. Oh, I just saw point number 4. Oh, I'm sorry. I might have given that away earlier today.
No, this is good. I know. As we're reading through this, I'm like, they're all kind of related, but this is okay. We're great. So point number 4 is climbers don't need to fuel with sugar like endurance athletes do. And again, sugar, scary word, right? Like immediately we think like sucrose or table sugar or something of the sort. But really, I'm talking about fast sugar, fast energy when I think about sugar and how this can apply to climbers as well. So I'll give you guys a little bit of a scenario here. So yes, we've talked about carbs, right? We've really driven that home. But what about the types of carbs that you're having? So you could bring a sweet potato with you to the crag. Okay. Now, sweet potato is going to have a little bit more fiber in there. It's more of kind of a complex carbohydrate. It's going to be absorbed a little bit slower by the body. In comparison to a sweet potato, you could also bring some gummy worms with you to the crag. Now, gummy worms are essentially pure cane sugar, and that's going to be absorbed really quickly by the body, and you're going to be able to utilize that fuel really fast. And oftentimes, we need a variety of all these different types of carbohydrates to really serve different purposes in our climbing. So let's say you are ready to red point something or ready to like try to send your boulder, whatever it is. 10-15 minutes before, oftentimes I'll recommend for athletes to have that simple, fast, quick hit of sugar to really give them that boost that they need before their performance, essentially, before they're going to like go do their thing and really try to send. So, and again, we think this is like a no-brainer if you're going to jump on a bike or go out on a trail or something. We know we need these fast acting carbs, but oftentimes doing these kind of different sports, I just think that I hear that oftentimes we don't think that this is applicable to us too, and it absolutely is.
Yeah, can we actually briefly talk about the difference between a sugar and a carb? Because you've been using that and I understand the biochemistry of it, but it is really important, I think, that we just make sure we know what we're talking about, what the difference is between sugar and a carb, and also maybe what the different types of sugars are, because I do want to say, there's nothing wrong with fueling with gummies, like you just said. But again, when Amanda talks about sugar, most of the time she's not necessarily talking about the sugary treats. Like we're not saying that's what all you should be eating.
Mhm.
And so because there's a lot of like natural sugars too, but a lot of people just think about table sugar when they hear the
Mhm.
word sugar. So if you don't mind explaining the difference between sugar and carbs and what are the
Yeah.
different types of sugars too that we can
Yeah.
consume.
Absolutely. So carbohydrates are referring to basically the small subunits that make up carbohydrates are sugars. So we kind of have all these different layers. We have like simple sugars, which are like single unit carbohydrates. We have disaccharides. I don't want to get too crazy here, which are, 2 unit carbohydrate or 2 unit sugars. And so basically, the way that I like to describe this is we get different types of these sugars in different types of carbohydrate rich foods overall. So, for example, if you're eating a piece of fruit, you're going to be getting natural forms of sucrose in there, natural forms of glucose, and all these different kinds of sugars made up in this whole food overall. And so, one thing, and I don't know if this is what you were kind of referring to, Katya, but we actually work really well from a performance perspective with a variety of different
Mhm.
types of sugars. So it's really, really great to consume a variety of different types of these carbohydrate rich foods overall. So again, that could look like bringing some rice cakes with you to the crag. It could look like some apple slices. It could look like a homemade muffin. All of those different things have different types of carb ingredients that are going to provide different types of
Yeah,
general sugars overall. What
yeah.
what can you add to that, Katya, to kind of help clarify?
I think that is really great. And I see we're about to start the next section, which is called How to Fuel. And Amanda's number point is using a mix of carb types, which is what she's already talking about. So maybe we can dive into this, which is really great. Yeah. What you just said, yeah, that's important. So like using a mixture of carbohydrates. And again, carbohydrates are just complex sugars. So in some
Yes.
ways, if a sugar is a bead on a string, carbohydrates is exactly that. So when we think about a sugar, it's really just like part of the carbohydrate. So when you eat sweet potatoes, you are consuming sugars. You're just doing it in the form of a carbohydrate, but our body is breaking down the carbohydrate into sugars. And there's all these different kinds of sugars, which I don't think is so necessary to dive into, the sucrose versus fructose. But what she's referring to is like really trying to mix things up. And if we can just briefly talk about kind of the different categories, and you started this already, which is great. So mixing it up, meaning having maybe some grains in there,
Mhm.
like the rice cakes, those are more like complex carbohydrates, or it's going
Mhm.
to be a mix versus having some fruit. Fruit can be really great, and different fruits themselves have a different combination of sugars too. So you can even mix that. You can have dried fruit or fresh fruit. I mean, the amount of sugar is going to be different, but both contain sugar. And obviously, like sweet potato, as she suggested, would be a really great source of fuel too. Honey is a pretty simple sugar too. That is something you can use in different ways. I actually have a friend, she literally just eats honey, straight
Love that.
honey. She loves it. And that's too sticky for me. But if you like that, and obviously, any kind of treat, if you bake muffins, all of that will have different types of sugars in there. So yeah, I was wondering, I just like giving people examples too for different
Mhm.
types of sugars. And honestly, even if you consume different bars, depending on what kind of bars you eat, but some of them might have a good amount of carbohydrates in them or not. So that's something that you might have to check. So some protein bars are really low in carbohydrates. So if you consume a protein bar, you might want to eat something with that.
Mhm.
But some bars have a lot of carbohydrates in there. I always encourage people to read their labels. What are some other good sugars? Let's say, what about crackers at the Craig or bread?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah,
all of the above. Yeah, crackers, bread, you can turn the bread into, again, like a PB&J sandwich as maybe kind of your more robust snack midday, something of the sort. And also like I just also want to tell people that it is okay to eat packaged foods
yeah,
too.
yeah.
Everyone has their own, set of values in terms of ingredients and what type of packaged foods they like to eat or don't like to eat, but those are sometimes going to be really, really great fast options. So for example, I'm obsessed with these, I want to say it's like the Nature's Bakery brand of fig bars. If you've had these fig bars, you probably know that they are amazing. They have a ton of carbs in there for like a very small amount. They're super easy to digest, really soft, which I think texture sometimes can really help promote people eating versus not eating. So that's a good example of things. Always a fan of dried fruit. Even again, if you're looking for a little bit of boost of those fast sugars, those simple sugars, get the dried fruit with sugar on it, with the sweetened version, which is maybe not something that you would do with for like an everyday snack. So yeah, applesauce packets. I'm a huge fan of baby food packets too. Those are definitely a go-to. So many different options in the carb category.
Yeah. And also, if anybody has any questions, feel free to message us as well. Actually, that
Yes.
did just remind me. I know you already talked about fueling misconceptions, but there's one I think would be really important to talk about that I would love to add, which is normally we like to listen to our hunger cues when it comes to eating. However, when we exercise, our hunger cues are suppressed. So that is a tricky one. And you reminded me of that when you said that these fig bars are easy to eat. And depending on the athlete, depending on what the type of exercise is in terms of, whether or not they're also like hiking or, carrying a ton of pads, but also what your nerves are like. If you're someone who gets really nervous, you might just not be feeling hungry for reasons that are unrelated to feelings. So I usually don't love to tell people to eat when they're not hungry, but there's a few exceptions. And if you feel like you're not performing to your best, and you're also not eating, it might be wise to just try to consume something. And Amanda already pointed at something. Certain foods are more dense in sugars and calories, so that means you don't have to eat a lot of them in order to fuel pretty well. So that might be something to play around with. If you're someone who has a hard time eating, I personally would not suggest eating an apple because that might just fill you up and you might not be eating enough. But if you're someone, so I would just recommend, let's say the bars that Amanda recommended, you can have just a small amount of that bar and be getting a lot of carbohydrates with that. And that is really good for people with squeezy tummies and people just have a hard time eating while being outside. Awesome. Let's go straight into sort of what's your recommendation for how many carbs to eat per hour if you're out
Let's do it.
for different sessions. Yeah.
Perfect. And so one thing that I'll start with is I'm going to throw around some numbers here. I will give some kind of, ways to actually interpret this into real life and like how much this is in food form, but I also don't want to make it too complicated for people. So then after I kind of talk about these numbers, I'll give more of like a practical, realistic strategy of how to kind of make sure you're hitting these targets without really having to worry about it too much. So again, if your sessions are out, or if your sessions are longer than 75 to 90 minutes in length, ideally, we're going to want to aim for anywhere 30 grams to 45 grams of carbs every hour that you're out. Okay, so breaking this up, let's say you're going to be out to, boulder outdoors for 4 hours. Ideally, you're going to want to bring 4 snacks at about 30 grams of carbs each, roughly. So that's kind of how this breaks down. Now, to give some real life examples, so if you are eating a packaged product, it's really easy to just flip that around, read the ingredient label, like you were saying, Katya, and the protein bars, and see how much carbohydrate is actually in the product that you're eating. Same thing with like a bread slice, right? It will give you a portion and it'll say how much carb is in that particular portion. Same thing, even like if you look at your bag of rice, it'll say, half a cup of dry is this many grams of carbs, for example. So just to, again, put this in real life, 1 slice of bread is normally around 30 grams of carbs. 30 grams is kind of a typical carb serving size. 1 tortilla is about 30 grams. 1 piece of fruit, like 1 apple or 1 banana, is about 30 grams. Those Nature Bakery fig bars that I was talking about are about 40 grams for the whole entire thing. So just to give you some perspective here. But another way to think about this is ideally, kind of like I mentioned earlier, plan to have 1 carbohydrate rich snack every hour that you're out. So again, that could be an apple hour 1. It could be your protein bar, a carb forward protein bar, hour 2. It could be a handful of pretzels, hour 3. Again, it doesn't have to be super complicated. As long as you're keeping up on it, that will get you most of the way there in terms of amounts per hour.
Yeah, that is really great advice, Amanda. That's a really great rule of thumb. So that's really, really awesome. Well, I thought I had a question for you, but I was just listening and I thought it's
That's okay. Well,
Yeah.
maybe we could talk about how this might vary a little bit depending
Yeah,
on the type of
that's the
session that you're
question I
doing.
had. Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you, Amanda.
Perfect. And again, I will say I go into a lot more like specific examples in the workshop that I did this last month. So if you guys are a member, definitely check that out. It's a recording. If not, maybe an exciting reason to join. But
Yeah, those workshops, they are, as they're going to be in
yeah.
the membership. So even people who are going to join, we're going to open the membership up again later this summer.
Cool.
And there's still other ways to join early if you really want to, but those courses and those workshops are always accessible. And Amanda's, she's doing more of them too.
Mhm.
And kind of depending on the need of the membership, she does different workshops. But yeah, let's cover quickly, how this fueling strategy might or might not change depending on whether or not this is now a 3-hour gym session. This is a half a day cragging session, either in bouldering or sport climbing, or maybe more of a trad climbing session, maybe in the mountains where there's also an approach.
Great question. So there are 2 variables that I want everyone to keep in mind when kind of thinking about this carb requirement per hour and how it might change. The first is intensity, and the second is time, like total time out. So if you're having a really, really intense session, your carb requirements are going to go up. And additionally, if you're having a very, very long session or a long day out, carb requirements are also going to go up. Now, couple those 2 together. If you're going to be out for a really, really long time, I'm thinking like an alpine day, like a day up in the mountains where you're also trad climbing, like time is up, intensity is up, carb requirements are going to be maybe even higher than the ones that I gave today overall. So to give like a couple scenarios, if you are doing a 2-hour long gym session at a moderate intensity. So maybe you are doing limit bouldering. So like when you're actually on the wall, maybe you're trying really hard, but you're doing like really, really long rests in between, for example. I would say that's not a super, super intense session overall, and it's not a super, super long session overall. So even if you just aimed to eat one carbohydrate rich snack in the middle of that session, an hour in, even though that's not perfectly 30 grams of carbs per hour, that to me would be more than sufficient. You're having something, you're fueling, you're checking the box, you're setting yourself up for success for recovery. I think that's awesome. Now, let's say, take the gym example, you're doing a 3-hour session on ropes. And maybe you're doing like a volume session, like you're getting in like a ton of pitches. You're like really getting after it, maybe limited breaks overall. I would say maybe have that 30 gram of carb per hour snack while you're out there. So maybe you bring 3 carbohydrate rich snacks with you to the gym and you aim to have one every single hour that you're out. So that could be like some gym examples.
Yeah, I love this. Do you mind if I add to this? Just because I
Yeah.
do think some typical workouts that I see a lot of climbers do, and we certainly program this also, often includes a warm up and then a somewhat, whatever, an hour-ish to 90 minutes climbing session. And often climbers do strength training at the end of the day. Now, I will tell you, if you follow Amanda's guidelines for fueling early on in preparation for this longer session altogether, you're going to get so much more out of your strength session for 2 reasons. One, you will be much better fueled. And the better fueled you are, the harder you can lift your weights, the stronger you're going to get. And also, it's going to help you recover faster because you're not fully depleting your glycogen stores and including your protein stores. So protein synthesis will be up because we're not using the protein to create fuel. We're using it to actually build muscle. So especially, I think you should do this anyways, even if you're not doing this, but especially if you're doing a lifting session at the end of your climbing session, I really recommend using those strategies. We see big transformations for climbers doing that. So thank you for that, Amanda.
Yes. Oh, I love that so much because so many of us, especially if you only have 1 or 2 days, like if you're a weekend warrior just trying to squeeze stuff in, 1 or 2 days and doing really long blocks, then this is totally a conversation for you. And one kind of nuancy thing too that I'll just squeeze in here is timing as well. So some people do feel better fueling a little bit more frequently, but maybe in smaller amounts. So don't feel restricted to just having your one carbohydrate rich snack every hour. You could totally have a couple small bites of something every 20 or 30 minutes, for example. Again, especially if you're prone to like some GI upset or feeling like eating makes you heavy, that's definitely a strategy. I call it the microdose strategy. It's definitely something to try.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for saying this. Like a huge weight just lifted off me. I've been trying. There's been for a while, like snacking has gotten this bad reputation, I feel like. But I do the microdosing, what you said, so much. And I find great value in it. So I think this was such an important point to say, that even though we say have this one snack per hour, that does not mean you need to eat it all within 1 minute. It's just you can spread it out over the hour if you want to. So thank you for that. Wonderful. So those are the gym scenarios. Let's say, can you cover some scenarios that are like a half a day cracking scenario and then maybe like a bigger day scenario for the people who like to really go into the mountains?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I'll mention too is I'm actually going to kind of include one of our point number 3s into how to fuel kind of into this too, because it integrates really well.
That's a great idea.
Talking about outdoor days. So let's do like, I don't know, just like a typical day, sport climbing or bouldering outside. Let's kind of keep that as a similar intensity. Maybe you're out for like 6 hours. I would say that's probably a normal time frame. That's like normally how long we're out overall. Lots of time swapping blades, maybe chilling in between, but you're still trying hard on the wall. So in that circumstance, I would definitely aim for 30 grams of protein, or excuse me, 30 grams of carbohydrates at least every hour that you're out. Again, you could have it every hour on the hour, or you could microdose it, whatever works great for you. Let's say if for some reason the intensity of that went up, like maybe you're in a location that has a really gnarly approach overall, or maybe you ended up staying out way longer than you thought, you might be pushing closer to 40 grams, 45 grams of carbs per hour. So again, I want you to kind of use your best discretion, think about time, think about intensity to help modulate how much you need every hour that you're out. And again, we can just kind of feed that into, like I had mentioned earlier, alpine day out in the mountains at elevation. Maybe you're cold, maybe you're hot, all of these variables would likely indicate a need for a higher carbohydrate goal per hour. So again, instead of maybe aiming for 30, maybe you're having 2 30-gram snacks, aiming for 60 grams of carbs every hour that you're out, because you're hiking, you have a heavy pack, you're gear climbing, all the things. So hopefully that kind of gives a little bit of picture. And one thing that I'll squeeze in here too is, what about other things? What about protein? What about fat? How do these factor in, especially on outdoor days? So at the gym, if you're doing a 3-hour session, for example, I'm not worried about you having protein in your session. When we're outdoors, especially for longer periods of time, ideally, I do want you to include some light sources of protein. Maybe if your GI system can tolerate it, some light sources of fat as well when you're out, for a couple reasons. One, it's going to help you feel actually satiated, so you're not feeling hungry and hangry all day out. In that same vein, it's also going to help keep your blood sugar stable too. So it's actually going to help you kind of get longer use out of your carbohydrates overall, rather than constantly spiking and crashing all day. So multiple reasons why longer days outside, you really should be including maybe some beef jerky if you eat meat, or some protein bars in there as well, some hard-boiled eggs, like we had mentioned, tuna packets, trail mix to some extent. So I do want to mention that piece as well.
Yeah, that is really wonderful, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else? I thought this was really, really insightful.
Yeah.
All of this, talking all about how to feel best. And yeah, I mean, it's, as you're talking, I'm thinking about my fueling strategies too, always. I mean, I feel like I've got them pretty dialed, but there's always something like to refine. And one of the things that I definitely like to mention too is I feel like for people who like to go cragging outside, again, this comes back to our appetite sometimes being suppressed when we're exercising and also just when we're busy doing things. So sometimes I ask athletes a simple question. It's like if you think about the hours you went outside, let's say you eat breakfast at 7, you go outside at 8, and then, think about what you ate. And sometimes people realize they eat less food outside than sitting at their desk while working simply because time goes by so fast.
Yeah.
When in reality, again, especially if we're trying to perform outside, we need a lot more fuel, especially carbohydrates. So that is something for you also to keep in mind. And the last piece of advice, at least I want to share with people, or maybe just remind people, is if you're someone who feels like you're not getting the best out of your sessions for whatever reason, just give this a try. Even just like try, even if you don't want to count carbohydrates and you don't want to like look at the labels and see if it's 30 or 45 grams. What if you just, brought more snacks with you and just try to eat a little bit mid-session and see how you feel? Again, I promise you, we've seen so many athletes feel better, more joyful and stronger, and they just perform better and they can train better and they recover better. It's literally, I'm like, I want to tattoo this on my forehead. And I just want people to try it. That's what we encourage our athletes. Just give it a try and see how you feel.
Yeah, I love that so much. I mean, it really, again, it doesn't have to be super complicated. It could
Yeah.
just be, pick up some snacks at the store that sound good. I love grocery shopping or Instacarting or whatever you do, specifically plan for some climbing snacks and then bring them with you and just see how it goes, see what shows up for you and just try it on and see what happens. I think that's the
Yeah.
best way to start exploring this.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda. I want Amanda to give a little plug and how you can work with her. Of course, you can join Stronger Together, which is our climbing training membership. She's our in-house nutritionist there, which is so awesome to have her on the team. But Amanda does a lot more than that. She does not just talk, when I say just, I don't want to say just because it's so important, but she does so much more. So if there's anybody out there, it's actually one of the reasons we brought her on, because I used to do the nutrition coaching and I love talking about these, topics. But Amanda's expertise is so much broader than mine, and she can really help people with all sorts of different nutritional needs. So I would love for her to speak briefly about her expertise and how you can work with her if she resonates with you, because she's just a great human to work with.
Thanks. Yes. So I have a virtual private practice. So I see clients via telehealth, both on one-on-one, as well as I have a couple group programs as well that I offer. And I specifically work with, again, like I mentioned earlier, outdoor athletes, climbers, mountain bikers, cyclists, and runners are kind of, and strength athletes as well, kind of my primarily population, basically. And so in addition to sports performance, and when I say sports performance, I'm really talking about these fueling strategies, how to eat to climb or run or cycle better. I also do a lot of digestive and hormonal health as well. And so I really love working with clients who oftentimes have a GI or digestive complaint, for example, or especially for like menstruating people. I love talking about hormone health, whether that be menstruating, perimenopause, menopause, all the different varieties there. So those are really kind of my bread and butter cup and tea. So if that happens to resonate with you, if you are an athlete who maybe has hormone concerns or digestive complaints, who also wants to up-level their performance, then we would definitely be a good fit overall.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. So if someone is like, Amanda, I want to work with you, how can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. I am more active on stories right now than posting, but I'm definitely on there. So follow me. My username is or my handle, I guess you would call it. I feel old when I say username. My handle is at purely, PURLEY _nourished. I post some fun stuff there. I also have a podcast that I'm rebooting this summer. Also, you can link to that in my Instagram. And I also have a website too, purelynourishednutrition.com.
Yeah, and her name is Amanda Fitt, which is very
Yes.
suggestive. Fitt.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Amanda Fitt. Yeah. Fitt. Amanda Fitt. Look her up. She's amazing. And yeah, thank you all for listening. Drop some questions below if you have any, or message us. Message Amanda, message me. And it was such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, Amanda. And we're going to have to
Thanks,
do this again.
Katya. Yes, absolutely. Anytime.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.